Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Kirsty Buchanan, who is a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning to you.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Lovely to be with you both on, to mark phase 2 of Sir Keir Starmer's government today. And
It's
all
going
that
great
entails.
so far.
So far, so good. Roll on phase 3. That's what I say. Basically, with phase 2 in mind, we'll be talking about the budget build-up. It's now confirmed. It will be on the 26th of November, just a month before Christmas. How delightful. So the budget will be then. And also the kind of personnel changes within Downing Street between number 10, number 11, and what that might indicate about the direction of travel here towards the budget. And, of course, we're talking about Angela Rayner and stamp duty, and whether, by the time you listen to this, she will still indeed be a member of the Cabinet. That discussion to come. You, of course, can watch us on YouTube. Just search for Whitehall Sources to get full episodes there. And as you're watching or listening to us as well, you can WhatsApp us with your thoughts. The number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall, or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com. Right, we must start then with Angela Rayner. So we're recording this, just I think for the sake of clarity, on Thursday morning at just after 8:30. And already this morning, the story is moving really pretty quickly. So the basic outline here. Angela Rayner initially consulted 3 people before the purchase of her flat in Hove. It was £800,000, that flat. She has admitted to underpaying stamp duty on it. The BBC's reporting this, that there were 3 people consulted, 1 individual experienced in conveyancing, and 2 experts on the law around trusts before she made the purchase. The BBC notes it's unclear if any of these people were actually experts in complex tax law, and it's not known if they knew the full details of the trust, which was set up to help fund care for her son. The Times on this morning says Sir Keir Starmer will do everything he can to save Angela Rayner after that admission that she had not paid £40,000 in tax on her second home. She has referred herself to the ethics watchdog after saying she hadn't paid enough stamp duty. She said she had considered resigning over the matter, having claimed for weeks that she did nothing wrong when she bought the property in Hove, and insisting that she paid the full amount of tax. I will add to that we've had government ministers on Times Radio over the last number of days reiterating that she had done nothing wrong, and indeed her team were backing her all the way through this whole sorry saga. Right, Kirsty, it is slightly complex when it gets into the tax detail of this. Shall we start with the politics of where we find ourselves this Thursday morning, and whether Angela Rayner's position as Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary is now actually tenable?
It's an interesting one to start with, because sometimes when these scandals kind of erupt, well, you've done days and days and days of, I've done nothing wrong, how very dare you, wicked media types, only to find out that, oops, actually you have done something wrong. You move very quickly into this is not tenable, and you can hold on to your job for a relatively long time, but ultimately it's only a matter of time before you're forced to go or you're fired. This I don't think is one of those. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, for one kind of principal reason. If at face value what she's saying she can prove to be correct, that she sought advice from the right people and she gave them full information about what is an actually very complicated set of kind of tax and transfer of property rights situation. If she sought information from the right people and she gave them full kind of visibility about what she was asking for advice on, and they gave her the wrong advice, then I think most of us would say, look, it is awkward. Obviously, this is a housing secretary who has mistakenly not paid the right amount of stamp duty. But I think most of us would say, well, she did everything she could to get the right advice and she got the wrong advice. What are you going to do? I think the crux of this actually then revolves around, who did she seek advice from? Was that the right sort of person, organisation to seek advice from in the first place? Did they give her the wrong advice, or did she not fully explain the situation, which would enable them to give the right advice? I was struck this morning, I was listening to Times Radio, And Dan Needle, who's a tax expert and head of the Tax Policy Associates, said if she has spoken to the right person and given them the full kind of visibility of the facts, he would find it, I think his words were, extremely unlikely that she would have received the wrong advice. So I think there is a demand in that kind of sorting this out to everybody's satisfaction, that advice, if it is written down, is published. I mean, obviously, I appreciate some of this is sensitive information about relating to her family and her disabled son. Redact those bits, obviously, but I don't think that pertains to this issue. And I think for some people, that would kind of seal the deal on this and make it, a survivable issue. I think if there's any equivocation about any of that or any concerns expressed by Sir Laurie Magnus, then her situation looks less tenable. Either way, Reform and the Tories will continue to go at her for rank hypocrisy. This is a woman who, over the last few years, has hounded various cabinet ministers for issues similar to this, and demanded resignations kind of at the drop of a hat from Conservative frontbenchers. And she would be the first to be screaming about resignation if the shoe was on the other foot. So I think even if she's cleared by Sir Laurie, I think she is fundamentally, not fatally, but fundamentally kind of, her power position is denuded by this. And the Conservatives and Reform will continue to go on about this rank hypocrisy point, which is something that the public will be able to kind of get their head around.
Joe, to come to you on this, is it survivable? What are the politics of this? And that awful, but let's use a word, the optics of this. I mean, it just looks bad. We've had the phase 2 relaunch, reset, whatever it's called, in the last few days, and it's been completely derailed by the Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm still not sure whether it's survivable. I'm really torn on this whole thing because I have a degree of sympathy that her situation is very complicated. And there was obviously, I have a disabled mother, and I know that while our circumstances are different, that you do sort of have this regular sense, and Kirsty, I'm sure it's something that's crossed your mind as well. You have this real sense of concern about what's going to happen to somebody if something happens to you, and how do you secure their future when there's someone that is financially dependent on you. As a single mother, that's sort of even more apparent that I found with my family, my son, and also with my disabled mum. But there are a couple of things that really concern me about this. Number one has been this class war sort of set of accusations that people have been coming out and saying everyone's going after Angela Rayner because of her background and where she's come from. And actually, I think that's pretty rude, actually, to people that have a genuine interest in something that is in the public interest. She is Deputy Prime Minister. She's not just Deputy Prime Minister for Labour Party members. She is Deputy Prime Minister. She is the Deputy Prime Minister for people that didn't vote for her, for the whole country. So there is an interest in this, and the fact that housing in particular is under her brief. But more than any of that stuff, the fundamental question I have is, where the hell does she now live? She has a constituency in the north of England, and yet she now has a primary residence between London and the south, if you go by her explanation. Now, that goes to the very heart of all these people that when you're selected to be a candidate, one of the most fundamental points is, do you live in the constituency? And it's where people move heaven and earth. And I can remember working with Tory women in particular who had this awful situation where they would be asked by these outdated and very sort of old-fashioned constituencies who would say to the female candidate, well, how does your husband feel about moving to the area? Are you prepared to put your children in the local school? And the whole emphasis was around the fact that your roots were supposed to be in the constituency that you represent. You're supposed to have a base there. And yet the base is now a part-time arrangement because of her son. And I get that that is complicated. But she's fundamentally saying her primary residence is at a completely other end of the country. And that sort of is quite fundamental around representation and what we sort of have come to expect. And maybe this is a rewriting of the rules or the convention about how we expect people to be represented. But generally, you have a home in Westminster where you work most of the time and you have a base in the constituency and you make that double act work. Well, now there's a third residence in the mix. And so you kind of go, hang on a minute, how much time is therefore available to do all of the Deputy Prime Minister stuff, do the Westminster focused job of being an MP and being a government minister, and then still representing your constituency in some way? I just find the whole thing hugely complicated.
Oddly, I have much more sympathy than Joe does about that particular element of my main residence is a mere 260 miles away from my actual constituency, in part because of the personal arrangement. Because of the nature of her son's disabilities, that house has been significantly adapted to be able to meet his needs. It makes sense for her then not to sort of shuttle him between two different properties, as you frequently do when a couple gets divorced, because it would just be problematic. This, however, does raise a separate issue, because that means from the explanation that she gave yesterday, she was saying, well, look, it's our son's or our children's, but in this particular case, for this purposes, our son's residence. And so when I am staying there, I am staying there. And when his father is staying there, he stays there with him. This is interesting because obviously I've looked at these kind of issues myself, in part because of my son and his disabilities, etc. And the issue of primary residence isn't as weirdly defined in the law as you think it would be either. So what defines a primary residence? The kind of advice I got was, well, it depends how many days a week you stay there. And the kind of broad brush is 4 days a week. And if you sort of say, well, some days I might be there 2 days and some days I might be there 4 days, which is presumably for the Deputy Prime Minister, exactly the sort of thing you'd be saying. In school holidays, I would be there more, in working week less, etc. At what point is there a kind of cut and fast rule of, in the space of 364 days of a year, if you spend X amount of days in this property over, and average that out over the last 2 or 3 years, and frankly, who would know? Who would be able to say? In those circumstances, then that is your primary residence. So it is a little bit more fudgy than that. But I do, I take your point, Joe. She could have bought a second property
That's my issue. I don't have an
constituency.
issue with. I'm not against the idea that the house has been adapted. That's not my point.
Yeah.
But I'm married. I am living in a house in one part of London, and my husband lives in another part of London, because we have both agreed not to move our children from their schools. We wanted them to see out their education, and my mum is disabled, and moving her with all the adaptations that we've made, and our life is very complicated. But I got told recently by an accountant that because we're now married, we basically, although we own independently our homes, our tax position is that if we sell one of those, we're screwed on capital gains tax because we're married. But yet we have no financial interest in each other's properties whatsoever. But because we decided to get married, because it was the only way we could actually move our relationship on, we stay the odd day at each other's house. That's the best as we can do at the moment for the next few years. I apparently will get clobbered by the taxman for that.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is the tax system is an absolute joke, and it has been called upon to be simplified for years and years and years. And maybe Angela Rayner has done everyone a favour by, this whole debacle showcasing just how complicated it is. But I do just have a fundamental issue, which is, should you not have at least something that looks like a primary residence for a significant part of your week should be in the constituency that you represent? I just find the fact that it's hundreds of miles away now very just a really, I don't think it's a resigning issue, but I think it's a really interesting question as to how we're going to expect MPs to live in the future, because there's a precedent sort of being set that is, it's never really been talked about. I know other people have had other homes, but, it's quite a significant sort of journey that you've got to factor in when you're also, it's not just that you're an MP and you're shuttling between home and constituency, you're in London and constituency, you're also Deputy PM, which means you're moving around the country a hell of a lot. It's pretty complicated setup.
I just want to say a couple of things. One is, hilariously, as it would happen, coincidentally, we've been taking advice on stamp duty with a view to potentially buying somewhere in the, long term. And we were speaking to a tax lawyer last Friday morning, and I said, how do we do what Angela Rayner has done? And that tax lawyer said, I have no idea how she's done what she had been reported to have done at that point. Anyway, said tax lawyer emailed us yesterday and said, have you seen this? And we replied and said, yes, you called it in one. You said I don't think this is possible. And behold, here we are. And that was a 10-minute conversation that we had last Friday.
Which is back to Dan Needle's point on Times Radio this morning. If she had given the right person, a tax lawyer, the right information, the chances that he would have given her duff information about how much stamp duty she needed to pay on that Hove property would be unlikely.
Mm.
There is an interesting piece of, I can give you a bit of insider background if you like.
Yes, please, always.
On how this kind of story emerged. Another newspaper, and I will not name them, had the story about Angela Rayner's home in Hove a good week, 2 weeks before it broke. And one of the reasons it didn't break it sooner is it was looking at the issue of this new home entirely in the concept of Angela Rayner's love nest with Sam Tarry. Now, it is no secret that, she is now in a relationship with a former Labour MP, Sam Tarry, and is obviously divorced from her husband. And so that was the kind of prison that this newspaper was after, featuring this kind of new house in Hove. So they had all the details about the house. They had lots of kind of, stories about her going to the co-op and putting the bins out and blah, 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 blah. And they were waiting for a picture of her and Sam Tarry together coming out of the property, sitting on the beach, blah, blah, blah. He used to apparently sort of get into the back alleyway, which is why it was problematic to kind of prove that they were living there together. So that, Joe, might be some of the point of why she's not got, bought just another home down the road from her. Sam Tarry is a southerner, and if you're trying to set up home with somebody else, you're not going to be doing it in a constituency 2 miles down the road from your ex-husband. So that might be some of the reason why it is a mere 260 miles away from the people she represents. Ironically, what then happened is some just random punter took a photo on his mobile phone of that now classic photo that featured on the front page of the Daily Mail of her in the dry robe with a massive goblet of wine on the beach. He took it to the paper that was already kind of investigating her and asked for a sum of money, which was frankly very modest, and they turned it down. So he then took it to the Daily Mail. So when the Daily Mail first published that picture, they had no idea that she actually lived in Hove. They just said, she's on holiday, living her best life, total Ange kind of, slightly sneery Mickey take of the Deputy Prime Minister in the dry robe. And then another punter rang up and said, well, you do realise she's not on holiday here. She now lives here. And that's what spawned the kind of whole hunt for the Hove house. Somehow the Telegraph got involved in it. And then once all that emerged, it was then the Telegraph that started to say, well, hold on a minute. Is this your second property? Is it your main property? Et cetera, et cetera. The other interesting thing that we haven't picked up this yet, it emerged also this morning on Times Radio, that she, in terms of the timeline, the point that she sought this second piece of legal counsel where it became, at least on the face of it, apparent to her that she may have received the wrong advice, that was on Monday. Now,
can I just jump in and just to back that up, just with quotes from Bridget Phillips in the Education Secretary, because I think this is pertinent, something we'll talk about in a sec. So she was on Times Radio just before 7 o'clock, and here's the quote. What did happen was that Angela sought legal advice that came back on Monday. It was at that point that she applied to the court to have the order lifted that had prevented her from talking about some of these matters in detail in public before that because of the circumstances of her family. Once that order was lifted by the court, she then gave a full statement, gave a full interview, and set out the position as she understood it.
So at the point that the Prime Minister then went out and said, accused everyone of being sneery and snobbish about her and that she had done nothing wrong, did he, at that point, knowing that this was, on the same day she'd got this second piece of legal advice, did he know that at least there was a question mark over the, kind of these tax affairs on buying the Hove property? Did he know that at that point he went down? And subsequent cabinet ministers have sort of gone out in the last couple of days and said...
There's a suggestion the advice was draft advice on Monday and that it was confirmed on Wednesday morning.
Sure, but you would think that the first thing she would do, her office would do, would ring his office and say, look, hold on a minute, there's a bit of a... there was no equivocation in the Prime Minister's support for her at all. And actually, he turned around and suggested that anybody that suggested she had done anything wrong were a bunch of frightful snobs just out to get her because she was a good old working class woman who'd done good, and we thought this was all sneery. Did he know at the point that he made that, and when he stood up at the PMQs yesterday, did he know that there was at least a kind of, well, obviously he did by PMQs because it had broken by then, but when he came out on Monday and gave his interviews, did he know at that point that there was at least a question mark over the veracity of what she had been saying hitherto?
I do think there is a question there as well for cabinet colleagues, because they've spent a couple of days in the defence of Angela Rayner. I mean, Bridget Phillipson, to be fair to her, has done it again this morning. And that's fine and that's valiant and that's whatever. But we've seen this game before, haven't we? Where they say something and then the line changes.
Exactly. One of the things that most eroded ministerial support for Boris Johnson was that people again and again and again would be marched over the hill to defend him, only for 2 days later for him to have to backtrack on what he'd said, and it makes them look like chumps for going out and robustly defending. Now, they've got their own political reputations to maintain too. So some of that is not going to help. And the other thing that has been kind of mooched by some people that are less sympathetic within the Parliamentary Labour Party to Angela Rayner is, look, she's got quote-unquote form for this. We had all this issue last year with question marks about whether she'd paid the right kind of capital gains tax in terms of the sale of the council house that she once owned. And so if you've already had this kind of issue around you, I'm saying, why on earth wasn't she, much more careful, particularly given the complicated nature of this issue, to make absolutely cast iron sure that what she was doing was within the rules and not tax avoidance. For a woman who has routinely called tax avoidance, not evasion but avoidance, which is not illegal,
They're different.
disastrous for public services and an immoral act. She has evaded taxes. The issue is whether she avoided taxes. The issue is whether that's done deliberately or accidentally. And therein, I think, lies the entire crux of the nature of the advice she was given and why.
Yeah. Joe, what does all this mean for the Prime Minister? A couple of days into this phase 2 reset, here we go, change gear, blah, blah. And we're spending the entirety of our time talking about the Deputy Prime Minister's tax affairs.
Well, I mean, it's a few things, isn't it? Number one is, the damage to the reset and the getting hold of the agenda as was wanted this week. The second is potentially the damage in trust, if it is, that there is, we all talk about, what's tenable and whether someone is, whether able to stay in their job or not after something's happened. But there's also the reality about whether you can still command the confidence of the people around you when, if as, Kirsty, I think the point you're making about that issue around the draft advice and then the fact that Keir Starmer was making that impassioned defence on Monday, that is potentially the thing that gets you rather than actually the thing you've done. It's the potential misleading of your colleagues, whether
Cover up that kills you.
Well, it is kind of, it's not always the cover up. Sometimes it's the cock up, but it's the cock up that you have sort of ended up being responsible for because of, just being a bit, I'm not sure. I don't buy into the idea that I'm not convinced she's done something really underhand or really deliberately willful to try and pay less tax. I think this is probably more likely to be a monumental cock up in terms of it being quite complicated, thinking you've sort of told the people you need to tell the situation, being a little bit less thorough than perhaps you should be. Careless, I think, is probably a fairly good term, but careless in HMRC's view rather than our general view is a different thing. But I think that's probably where we're more likely to be. The real damage is potentially the fact that you've done that and then sort of really confidently said to your colleagues, there's nothing to see here.
Exactly.
Your colleagues have all gone, okay, well, Ange, of course I'm going to believe you because you're Ange and you always tell the truth and, I've no reason to doubt you. And then actually they've all been screwed over by getting caught up in the circus because of the carelessness at the beginning. And it's sort of, it's got all the hallmarks of being a sort of classic cock up that will end up killing a career as opposed to, and it being worse because she was the attack dog and because she's been the attack dog. It's that thing of, well, I was I was suggesting I was holier than thou and everyone else should be, and now I haven't been. And I've also sort of trampled all over my colleagues in the process because I've been trying to continue that sort of look. So that's where I think that's the big challenge for the PM, is that the PM's also got to look to all the colleagues and sort of say, I'm really sorry, guys, you all went out to bat like I did and we all look a bit stupid now. And that's the problem if this then goes in the way that it could do, depending on where the ethics decision comes down. And we know that the ethics stuff doesn't need to be clear cut on the mistake or the action, but we know that there has been this form around how things have been worded to suggest that something could have been done better, or that, something is more problematic. And fundamentally with all these things, when it was the homelessness minister, it was because of the actual thing that happened. When it was corruption, it was the thing that was happening around it. It's almost the intrinsically linked to the brief that you've got, and then the misdemeanor or the mistake that happens, and the fact that they're too intrinsically linked. And that is a big problem. So I think he's got a real challenge on his hands, because who then becomes the attack dog? The irony is that this is the Deputy Prime Minister who helpfully wrote some advice for the Chancellor on how to handle the public's finances only a few months ago, and, was seen as being Angela and a big intervention. And that looks a bit stupid now, doesn't it?
Indeed. Anna Mihailova, the fantastic new political editor for Times Radio, reports this morning that Sir Laurie Magnus, the ethics advisor, may report back as soon as today on what has gone right and wrong in this situation. So keep an ear out for that a little bit later on as well. Right, we've just got a few minutes of the pod left today. And actually, you mentioned there, Joe, the country's finances. Rachel Reeves might be pleased to see Angela Rayner's difficulties, if for no other reason that it stopped us talking about the massive black hole. I suppose in some regards, I say that, and as I'm saying that, and I do declare an interest in this, there are now calls for stamp duty to be abolished at the at the budget, which I feel like might be a little bit far from what the reality is going to be. Anyway, in the last 24 hours, the Chancellor has rejected forecasts of a £50 billion black hole in the public finances, despite higher borrowing costs and expected tax rises, absolutely piling pressure on the Chancellor ahead of the budget. It's been confirmed that will take place on the 26th of November. She says that those speculating about her plans, a lot of them are talking rubbish. Note, not all of them. The cost of long-term government borrowing rose to a 27-year high on Tuesday. And so it fuels the concern, the speculation that the Chancellor will have to either raise taxes or cut spending, or potentially both. The Conservatives say the government don't know what they're doing, quote. Kirsty, on to you on this one. This week we also saw, as part of phase 2, a sort of reshuffle of staff in Downing Street, bringing in sort of economic advisors, big brains to kind of direct the decision-making when it comes to the Chancellor's budget. I mean, we're still heading in the same direction. Is anything getting better for the Chancellor at this point?
No, and it's an interesting decision to play long in terms of the date of the budget. It's not the latest autumn budget ever, but it's coming kind of pretty close to it. Look, on the one level, I suppose you play long because you're hoping that the situation will improve and that you've got more time to show the OBR that actually you're on the right track and you're doing the right things to improve productivity and speed growth. On the downside of that, the longer between then and now, the more idle speculation, the greater the sense that will grow that whatever happens, we're all going to get, the shoes that we wear and the air that we breathe taxed by a Treasury in trouble. And other things could go wrong. The economy could get worse. It doesn't necessarily get better if you play it long. The markets, we've had a significant kind of wobble in the markets this week already. Gilts are at a sort of 27-year high. The cost of long-term borrowing for the government is now higher than the good old peak of catastrophe that was Liz Truss and her mini budget. The issue is perilous. At any point, it could frankly tip over on some unforeseen event between now and November. I guess they're arguing for time. And I think the fact that the economic team at the number 10 has been strengthened doesn't read to me like a vote of confidence in Rachel Reeves to dig themselves out of this. It does try and tie much more directly number 10 to the success or otherwise of this budget. So the jeopardy point becomes actually much higher for both Number 10 and the Treasury if it goes wrong. I guess that one of the reasons they've pushed it long is because they've got this new economic team. They need time to get under the weeds of it, get to grips with it, and come up with a kind of plan that they both agree on. But it now looks like this budget is being steered far more by Number 10 than by the Treasury.
And is that a good thing, Joe?
I mean, it's hard to say, really. I think you're ultimately intrinsically linked anyway. But I think perhaps some of the optics of things that maybe are being suggested within the Treasury, perhaps there will be a greater oversight, given that, the narrative that Rachel came in last year and got duped by Treasury officials over the cut to winter fuel, then you could suggest, well, hang on a minute, this is a way to ensure there is greater oversight and perhaps a better attempt to sell the messaging of anything that is going to be done. But, this is also a government, this is an interesting time because, this government's made a lot about, interest rate cuts and how that's been a big success of almost their last year. They've used that as one of their indicators. And yet now the governor of the Bank of England is saying that future cuts are looking pretty unlikely. And so sort of, there's already this sense of the outside noises that I think also Number 10 and Number 11 have got to be really, really careful about the messaging in terms of how they're lining up this budget. They've got to think about the messaging they've already put out previously and how they're going to manage anything that looks like it's going to contradict that, because it will look like they've gone back on promises. But, everyone's very, very braced for the fact that they're going to have to go back on something.
Yeah. And the high cost of borrowing, Kirsty, I know is something that we wanted to reflect on the pod today, because actually we are so hamstrung by debt in this country that is the thing that is underpinning the difficulty the Chancellor has and the frankly minuscule, if any, room for manoeuvre that she has come budget day.
Yeah, we talked about this last week, didn't we? One of the reasons, look, we are an outlier now in terms of G7 countries, in terms of both the levels of debt we've got and the amount of money it costs to service them, in large part because quite a big chunk of our debt, 25% of it, is inflation linked. And obviously inflation is proving remarkably sticky at the moment. It's almost double where it should be. If anyone's not seen it, I would recommend a series of charts, graphics that Ed Conway has on X feed,
on Sky,
which shows two things. One, it shows just how much trouble we are in comparative to other countries, but it also shows, before we all have nightmares and are never able to sleep again, it also shows how a relatively small increase in productivity would go a long way to digging us out of some of this hole. But as we haven't managed to solve the productivity or growth gap in this country for many a year now, do I have a huge amount of faith in the new economic team at Number 10 or the team at the Treasury to do so? The short, blunt answer to that is no, not really. Brace for lots of tax impact, and what might be being pushed out might not be exactly what they're thinking about. But what I think we can all agree on, and what none of us think is going to be anything other than 100% likely, is that we are going to get a whole slew of new taxes in the budget levied at us, at businesses, at working families in various different ways, not directly, obviously, but indirectly. And life is going to get a lot tougher for all of us. And some of that is because the Parliamentary Labour Party has proved to its own leadership, despite its massive majority, that it won't countenance welfare cuts, which are in their own right unsustainable. So I think the idea that, we've got many, many more weeks of idle speculation about which taxes are going to rise, and a growing sense that we will be, left to foot the bill for the failings of the Treasury and the failures of last year's budget to speed growth, in fact actually put a brake on growth, is not going to do this phase 2 reset of the Labour government any favours whatsoever.
There we are. Kirsty and Joe, thank you both very much indeed. We will keep an eye then on Angela Rayner. Will she still be the Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary by the time we speak on this podcast next week? We've reflected that Sir Keir Starmer says he wants to do everything he can to save Angela Rayner. Wes Streeting notes Stephen Swinford of The Times. Of course, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, said yesterday it would be a, quote, absolute travesty if she had to go because she's made a, quote, honest mistake. Steve Swinford says that line is thought to have been cleared by Number 10. And so we await Sir Laurie Magnus, the independent advisor on ministerial standards. Will he be damning? Will it be sort of hedge your bets time? And what decision does the Prime Minister make? And does he emerge from it unscathed? It remains to be seen. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thanks for being with us on the Whitehall Sources podcast. We will talk to you again next week.